So, speaking of Shaquila and getting grounded, that was actually my first question to you. This is a very challenging time for many people, but particularly people of color. And so we often like to ask folks, what is it that you are doing personally as a person, as Mark? What are you doing to stay grounded and centered in this time?
Yeah, thanks for that. First, I think for me, being grounded both in my faith and family. The Bible teaches us that there's really nothing new under the sun, right? And so although we may be experiencing certain things for the first time or certain things in our lifetime, it's not like this is the first time this event or events we're going through have taken place. So just trying to keep in mind that, yes, we're going through things during this period of time, because they do have great impacts, but, we're not alone in this. It's really nothing new. At the same time, it's new for us, so it does have a great impact on us. I'm thankful that I don't have any family members at this time that have been impacted by, the virus itself, or even being off of work per se. I think most of my family members have, survived that, which is, something a lot of people can't say. So definitely empathetic about that. So that's very personal. I think on a more on a higher level, especially for communities of color and especially for the Black community. In some respects, yes, we've been hit with another challenge, but in our line, it's just another challenge. It's not like this is a major shock to our system. It's just that next challenge that's been thrown in front of us. Yes, it is impacting the Black community in such a great way, but it's just another one of those roadblocks that has been thrown in front of us. And I think as a people in this country, as roadblocks have been thrown in front of us, we've managed to, go over, find a way over, to knock them down or to go around. And so I think we need to, be that vigilant or as vigilant in this episode as well.
Yep. So we'll get into a little bit of the history of your organization. Poise is a community foundation based in Pittsburgh. And you serve the Black community specifically. So tell us a little bit about your work and your history.
Sure. So the foundation was created in 1980 by a man named Bernard Jones, who actually was my lifelong mentor. And so he ended up passing away in 2002. And as you mentioned, I was working for one of the big four public accounting firms at that time, but had such an impact on my life that I did a huge career shift. Now, I was already on the board of the foundation and had done some work with the foundation in the past, but just understanding the nature and uniqueness and the power of this foundation led me to step in his shoes. And so the foundation is, as you mentioned, is a Black-led. Our board of trustees right now are all African-American. Our program staff, or our total staff, we have 11 people on staff right now, one white, one Asian, the rest are African-American, Black. And so our whole focus is really the Black community. And so for us, again, what we're going through right now is not something that is causing us to make major shifts. The mission of our foundation is really to see how can we help Pittsburgh region and really beyond, develop more sustainable practices, become more self-sufficient. So from that perspective, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's the social unrest, whether it's high unemployment, all these are factors that we have been looking at and trying to figure out and help our community figure out, how do we deal with these? How do we drive that equity that needs to take place, in order for us to continue knocking down those roadblocks, but creating a more equitable environment so there aren't as many roadblocks, in our way.
Mm-hmm. When we prepped for this conversation, you told a story about the founding of this organization that I think speaks to trust at a very fundamental level. It was about a lack of trust that this community would be taken care of by philanthropy as it existed. Could you tell that story and just kind of explore some of the ways trust factored into that?
Sure. So I think the story that I told, hopefully I didn't tell too many during the prep session. It involved our founder even prior to the foundation. And he created many organizations prior to the foundation, but he served on a pretty powerful organization here in Pittsburgh called Allegheny Conference, and it was even much more powerful back in the 60s, 70s. We had a lot more of the corporate Fortune 500 corporations here. But he served on a grant committee, and he was actual staff person. And this committee was made up of a lot of the CEOs and top executives of corporations around Pittsburgh. And he told me this story over and over again, where he was at a grant committee meeting one day, and the participants were going around talking about different projects that they wanted to have funded in the Pittsburgh region. And it came to him, it was his turn, and he talked about getting $10,000 to support a work program he's trying to develop in the Hill District, which was primarily African-American at that time, to get young kids, teenagers, this was after the destruction of a lot of the Hill. And so get them to clean up their neighborhood. He wanted to pay them, actually put them to work and pay them so they weren't hanging out on the streets and doing different things. And the chair of the meeting said, Bernie, that sounds great. We'll table that. We'll table that for a minute. And they kept going around to, got to another gentleman at the table. And he said, gentlemen, it's been brought to our attention that in the Pittsburgh Zoo, the gorilla path is just in disrepair. And, we just have to do something about this gorilla path, and it's going to cost $3 million to fix it, but, it's important for us to do that. And everyone at the table, yeah, we'll pass that, And Bernie Jones just sat back and said, do they actually realize that I'm in the room, first of all, and the fact that they decided to spend $3 million on a gorilla path, but tabled or wouldn't give me $10,000 to help Black youth in the neighborhood. And it was those type of instances, that just kind of drilled in his mind the need to build. One other quick story I'll share is when Poise Foundation was started back in the early 80s, they went to a bank and said, we want to start a trust account in the bank. And the banker came through them and said, well, gentlemen, you have to have $1 million in order to start this type of account in the bank. And they said, okay, fine. A few years later, came back to that bank. Walked in the door, same gentleman was working at the bank. We want to start, this trust fund in the bank. And the guy said the same thing. Well, gentlemen, you have to have $1 million to start, a trust of this type in this bank. And they, pulled out basically a cashier's check and said, here's $1 million. His first response was, well, where did you people get $1 million, right? And again, it's just that idea that we're not deserving or we don't have the ability. How did you do this? You're not supposed to be able to do, things of this nature.
Mm-hmm. Right. So all of that fits into this context of where philanthropy, where nonprofits kind of sit in our space. And we did a report on trust, and we released it last month, where it showed there was actually a pretty big discrepancy between how nonprofits are trusted and how philanthropy is trusted. And so philanthropy has a pretty low level of trust with the American people. From your experience and from what you read in the report and sort of your experience as someone who leads a foundation, how much of that resonated with you? What do you think is behind some of that?
Sure. I think it does resonate, and it doesn't surprise me in some respects. I think when we think about trust, and most of us have probably have done this or heard this before, that you can think about trust in layers of circles, right? So that first inner layer is probably your family. And then that next layer might be, your set of friends. And then maybe you go up one more layer and, that's either your neighborhood or it's people of your culture. And then you finally get to this external external layer that is probably just the general public. And so the closer that layer is to you, the more trust that there is that you have within that circle. And when you think about nonprofits and you think about foundations, typically they're on that last layer. Some might be on that third, that cultural layer. And I think you have many more nonprofits that would have a more cultural context or competence than you would have foundations. Poise Foundation, to our knowledge, is maybe one of 2 or 3 Black community foundations in the country, right? So we're very unique, which means that just about every other community foundation, which there are, several, hundreds, if not thousands, as well as private foundations, are not people of color. And so, first of all, just when you think about that level of trust and the history of what's taken place in this country, people of color are not going to have an extreme high level of trust of people that are not their culture, who do not look like them, first of all. Then when you think about our system, there is, and rightfully so, I'm not saying this is always a bad thing. Some of it, is inherent in the system. There is not so much a shield, but a disconnect between the people who are actually being served and the foundation community, right? First of all, foundations fund work that's done by somebody else. So foundations are not typically out on the front lines interacting with community. And so if you never develop those type of relationships, then you're not going to develop the level of trust that comes from relationships. And so I think, that alone, accounts for a lot of that lack of trust, where people in communities are seeing nonprofits, they're interacting with nonprofits. However, I'll take it another step, just talking about the cultural piece. If you're just talking about nonprofits, I think there's a difference and a different level of trust if that nonprofit has cultural competence or is part of that community versus having a nonprofit come from outside of that community and delivering services. So there's, if you think about it from those circles, you're always going to have a deeper level of trust when the relationships exist at a deper level.
So how do you then navigate, especially right now, where so many more philanthropy organizations and nonprofits are sort of awakened more so maybe than even a year ago to the needs of communities of color, to the injustices that communities of color often face, that on top of COVID. How do you navigate this system being who you are in the history of what you have? I mean, is there hope in all of this recognition, or are you anticipating this too shall pass and things will sort of get back to a status quo especially in Pittsburgh? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure. So yes, I definitely have hope. I've talked to several foundation presidents, people in foundations. I've also talked to people, CEOs of corporations, and there is this tone that we know that we can't continue to do what we've done in the past, right? If we're going to deal with equity and if we're going to deal with race, that we need to. I think the hard part for us as institutions and really as people in this time, because I always say our society is kind of like instant. We're in a microwave society, right? We want to see something happen, then we're off to the next thing. And what we're talking about dealing with right now is how do we take a moment and really make it a movement, right? And so that's going to be the hard part. People have been sequestered. People have had time to think in different ways and about different things. They've seen everything shut down, and then they've seen the disproportionate impact that it's had on communities of color. And so we've had that moment to really think of these issues. Our concern is if we don't somehow take this moment and make sure that it is truly a movement and a long-term movement, that in 6 months and a year from now, we'll be off and thinking about the next issue. What I will say in Pittsburgh is that a couple things. So one, I've been invited into conversations with people that I won't say would not have happened, but just have happened, did not happen in the past. And so I think this moment has at least raised the level of, we don't know, we don't always have the answer. And so, who can we reach out to? The fear is that, especially as a Black focused foundation, that people look at Poise as though we have all the answers, right? I tell people all the time, just because we're a Black community foundation does not mean I understand every issue that's happening in all of our communities, especially lower income communities. So one thing we do is we typically, if we're trying to do some work in the community, we'll find an ambassador in that community, build trust with that ambassador who already has trust with others. And so that's one thing that I think our foundation community needs to think more deeply of, especially if your foundation is not a diverse staff. How can you find ambassadors, right, within communities that you're looking to serve, such that you're getting the feedback, the answers? Most foundations have very small program teams. So, they don't have the ability to be in the community and do that deep dive in communities the way a lot of nonprofits do. And there are many more nonprofits than there are foundations, right? But how do we find those ambassadors? Maybe that's a nonprofit, maybe it's community members. But we need to make sure that, again, especially as non-diverse foundations are looking to change their thinking or do something different, they need to really reach out to ambassadors and make sure that voice is brought to the table.
Mm-hmm. I mean, have you seen an example of that being done very well? And does it take, the relationship, or do you think fundamentally the philanthropy, the institutions need to change, or is it both?
Yeah, I definitely think it's both. Again, like I said, and I try to be as transparent and honest as possible as I talk about this. So when you think about most family foundations, and most foundations are either family foundations or private foundations. And if you look at the trustees of those foundations, if it's a family foundation, 9 times out of 10, you have members of that family who serve on the board who are, and this is no disrespect or anything of that nature, they are extremely far removed from the community they're trying to serve, or part of the community they're trying to serve, right? And so I don't know if there will be a will to actually infuse in the actual boards of some of these foundations more diversity. And I don't mean just diversity, not being family members, but true diversity, especially sure. Representing the community you're trying to serve. I think that same thing, we really need to think about that on staff, from the foundation staff. It's hard to, when you're in a room making decisions based off your own experience, trying to help others who you have no experience with. I know Pittsburgh, we're still very segregated. Other than maybe coming together downtown to work, or in certain respects, our communities are still extremely segregated. So what happens there is that outside of a work, setting, you really do not get a chance to understand who people are. And one thing that Poise did several years ago, we were conducting a process trying to develop a vision for what a sustainable Black community would look like in Pittsburgh. And so first thing we did was we selected various neighborhoods that we wanted to talk to and some other constituency groups. So the first thing we did, and these were all Black people, we found ambassadors to those neighborhoods. We did not go into neighborhoods and say, we're here, we're trying to create all these answers. We found ambassadors, connected with them, helped them to understand what we were trying to accomplish and look for, and then they connected with community people. The second thing we did after those interviews were done, we sent out a survey. And this survey just asked about values. What do you value, in your community? What do you value as a person? And what came back was not necessarily a surprise to us, but the reason it was important for us to do that, and these were all surveys of the Black community, the values that came back were the values that anybody, I don't care where you're from or who you are, would attest to, right? Strong families, safe neighborhoods, opportunities to work, to take care of my family, good education, health. And so, I say that because there's really no difference in what we want as people, what we want as human beings. The difference becomes the opportunity side, right? And if you don't have the opportunity to achieve those things, then we need to start asking. I think the last panelist, one of the things that they mentioned was why. That's a question I love, because when you start talking about why, then you start getting down to the root cause of the issue. And if you ask why enough and are really concerned, then you have to sit and listen. And through that listening, you begin to build relationship. And that relationship piece is what I think us as foundations really need to think about. The last thing I'll say about that is I often say in our sector, the foundation nonprofit sector is the only industry I know where the customer does not make the final decision, right? If I go to purchase something, if I don't like the product, I don't buy it. So that's my decision. In our industry, foundations work with nonprofits to provide some level of service to the community, but it's really the foundations and nonprofits do all the talking. And foundations rarely, get to hear from or reach into the community. And so we really need to think about that. How do we bring that customer, the actual people we're trying to help, into that conversation? Might be hard, but I think it's worth it.
So, you mentioned, the opportunity piece not matching with what the values are, what folks want. And that's a lot of times where advocacy work comes in and like systems change work. And I know you all focus on that. So one, I want to hear a little bit about that work and sort of how that may or may not have shifted in this time that we're in now. But then secondly, tied to that, sort of the piece about bringing in community voice. How do you do that? How do you ensure that they are also part of that solution and part of the advocacy change that you need to create more opportunity?
Sure. So there are several, we're a very small foundation. And so probably 10 years ago, I took a step back and said, as a small grant making foundation, how can we have a greater impact in our community? And for me, it was, again, going back to this root cause issue. How do we drill down and think about what some of the root cause issues are that, keep the Black community specifically, where it is, and having all the disproportionate or the disparities that exist in almost every category that you can look at. For me, it came down to really looking at two areas. Our families, our family structures and values of the last several decades have kind of broken down. And at the same time, our community has broken down. And so when you put those two things together at the same time, where, I come from a single parent household, but in the late 60s, in the Black community, two-parent households represented about 70% of households. Now it's down to 23%. And even within my own household, we had neighborhood and people around us that wrapped around us. And so if we were missing something, it didn't really feel like we were missing something. So this idea of advocating for strengthening Black families was something that was important to us. And we're not talking about necessarily the structure of what a family looks like. Our families look like and take up many structures, but what is the value of family, right? Family is your first educational institution. Often we talk about early education, but from 0 to 3, that's where the family is educating that child. And if that child does not receive, basic type of learning, then they are going to be behind good chance for the rest of their lives. So advocating for family was something strong within us. Then this idea of, again, what does it look like to have a sustainable Black community in which our community is becoming more self-sufficient and taking care of itself. How has that shifted since COVID-19 and maybe some of the social unrest? I wouldn't say that we've actually shifted our thinking, but what has changed is that there are a lot of more organizations that have come to the table and are really thinking about what does equity look like. So one example is in Pittsburgh, we've formed this Black Equity Coalition, which includes a couple funders, includes individuals from one of our universities, School of Public Health. It includes a few nonprofits, and includes just various people coming together right now looking at the impact that COVID's had, but on a longer term, how do we stay together to really look at the inequities that exist, and how do we change? How do we advocate for that change? And we've been successful in a very short period of time. We're working with our Black elected officials. We've had meetings with our county exec and mayor, the governor's office. We're working with a secretary at the state level of Department of Health regarding this issue. But I think now what's different is we're seeing a lot more voices trying to come to the table, again, from a lot of different places, trying to understand how do we shift? How do we change? Again, that's not up to us, Poise Foundation, to answer, but I think as a community, we can figure that out. Again, my fear is that, this is a tremendous moment. It could be a tremendous movement. How do we just keep it, at the movement level?
One of the things I heard recently about this notion of taking something that is a moment and making it a movement is also feeling like that shift is authentic, and that it acknowledges some of the pain and hurt that existed because of what is our reality.
Sure.
And so what do you think about this idea of not just individuals, but also institutions sort of atoning for some of the harm they may have done, either directly or indirectly, before kind of moving into the space of collaboration and co-creation and like moving forward together? And have you seen that happen, or do you have any thoughts on how that can happen?
Yeah, I think that's very tricky. Do I think it needs to be done? Yes. What institutional and systemic racism has done is basically said, if you go back to that opportunity side, again, we're all human beings. We all pretty much want and value the same things, but you have systemically held back, people of color at different levels from obtaining, and being able to live out those values. And so that has caused, irreparable damage. I'm not sure how you necessarily fix that. I don't know how or what that value is going back to fix that. But I think it needs to be acknowledged. I think, the example I use is somewhat like a seesaw, right? We know that, seesaw, either side can be balanced in different ways. Equity to me looks like, where we get that seesaw where we're both kind of at that same level. But we know reality right now is, white communities here, people of color, in particular Black people, are down here. So in order to create that equity, there needs to be a different level of resource added to one side, right, than the other, which means that equity is not, okay, we understand now if we're putting $1 million into this community, we need to put $1 million into this community. Right. Equity means that, this community is here. So to raise this one up, we have to create more resources and invest more resources. And I think that's only going to happen when we as a society, really take a hard look back and say, okay, these inequities, in the past took place. They created, again, whether you today are to blame or not, they created the space for you to be at this level. And so if we truly want to have this conversation about equity, then it has to be more investment. We have to go back and say, how do we correct a lot of the wrongs that were done? And from a foundation and nonprofit perspective, in my mind, that has to involve some level of asset transfer, right? So this is not just, how do we put more programming in, not just from the foundation perspective, government, from corporations. It's not just about how do we put, some corporations have said, we're going to invest $1 billion. Is that program dollars you're investing, or is that asset building? Is that asset transfer that you're investing? I think only at that time, we're in a capitalistic society, and assets, mean carry tremendous weight, and the definition really is it's a future value, right? So only when we get to that conversation about some level of asset transfer and investing assets into communities of color, I think will we really get to that place where we can have a conversation about equity.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that comes up in, especially in the nonprofit space, is how do we as individuals also not become better allies or better support system for all of this work, while not being sort of the center of attention a lot of times. Again, any thoughts on that, or have you seen that work really well where there's been either an organization or individual who's really showed up the right way in this work for you?
Right now, I think we have a lot of people that have expressed that that's where they want to be. Mm-hmm. I think time will tell. In Pittsburgh, we have had so many situations where, whether it's government, whether it's corporate society, whether it's philanthropy, whomever said, we hear you and we know we need to make change. We're 10 years later and we get the same disparity report, and then another 10 years later and there's the same disparity report. So, I'm thinking that this is a different moment, just because of, even when you look at the social unrest that's happening, it's not just Black people or people of color out there marching with a few, white people joining in. There's a movement, hopefully, definitely a moment where so many people are saying, this has to change. And so I'm hoping that that's the case here. I don't know, I won't give an example, or can't give an example of just an individual that is doing that. But I will go back to the fact that if you really want to see change, and if you kind of want to take yourself out the spotlight, if you're somebody of power, invite voices in, right, of the people that you're trying to help. So often because power, for whatever reason we say, has been successful, power thinks it has the answer as to how to make someone else successful, without understanding the cultural context of why, that success may not be, in this community. And so we need to bring those voices in. I think communities of color, for the most part, have strategies. They have direction. They know what they want. They typically know what they need. And most of the time, it's just a lack of resources. And it's a lack of steady investment. We can't afford to have 20 cents on a dollar be invested into a community and say, okay, you guys should be better. And we also can't have a 3-year strategic plan say we're going to invest in this community and then say, okay, community, at the end of that 3 years, you should be better. This is going to be long-term work. It's a long time getting here. It's going to be a long-term solution. And that's, I think, going to be the key to see whether the philanthropic community, the corporate community, and our government community are willing to invest those long dollars, which kind of goes back to your point before about, reaching back and understanding, what the issues really were and how do you invest to, you can't eliminate that, but how do you invest more heavily to make sure the future is not the same?
Bringing folks into the community is actually related to one of the questions we got, so I'll ask you that in a minute. And just to remind folks, go ahead and send in your questions in the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to as many of your questions as we can. But a question here from Terry: what kind of impact have you observed in terms of the foundation decision makers being far removed from the communities they are looking to affect? So when they don't do it right, what happens?
Yeah. I think what we see and what we talk about often is you can have a solution that works in one community, right? So let's say you have a solution and you apply it to a more wealthy community, and that solution works. I think often what happens if you're disconnected from other communities, then you, in your mind, you're saying, well, this solution worked here. Let's just take it, port it to this community, apply it the same way, and it should work. And then when it doesn't, the community gets blamed, right? And so this whole idea of thinking that we have answers for somebody else's life or the way somebody else's neighborhood or the way somebody else's community should work, I think is a losing proposition. Even if that works in your household, your neighborhood, your community, that does not necessarily mean that's the same thing that's going to work somewhere else. Especially, I think we lose sight of there are various cultural differences. There are ways that we apply different things. And so we need to bring that voice into the room so that we understand that. One of my friends, hopefully I'll do this real quick. One of my friends that I used to work at an accounting firm with left and went to work for a large corporation. He grew up in an all-white neighborhood. We worked for the accounting firm for probably 4 out of maybe 300 Black people that worked there. He got pushed around to different business units, ended up in Atlanta. He said, when I was in Atlanta, I had 5 direct reports. He said, I had 2 white guys, a Black lady, an Asian person, and one other, I can't recall, maybe a Hispanic person, but it was a very diverse team. He said, when I would put out answers, when I put a question out to them, I would get 4 or 5 different answers back, and we would go over that and think through that and come up with a great solution. He said, when I came back to Pittsburgh and worked for a company, I had 5 reports again, all white males. He said, when I would put a question out to them, I would get the exact same answer coming back to me from everybody, right? Mm-hmm. And so we come to the table with our own experiences, with our own biases, and if we don't invite others into that conversation, we leave the table with our own experience and our own biases. And that's not always the right answer for everybody.
Yep. So we have a question here. How do you become involved in this coalition as a Black funder? So someone who must be from the area wants to know more. So any information you want to provide them on that?
Sure. So that's something we're thinking about. Again, right in the moment, we are deep into responding to the COVID issues. And so we're doing a lot around data collection. We're doing a lot around testing. I've been doing a lot of work around small business and the impact that COVID-19 has on small business. I think as we come out of this, we're thinking much more of a longer term strategy. So if you're from the area, look me up. I'd be glad to have the conversation to get you involved. We're also looking to connect with others in the state to create a statewide coalition. We recognize that this is not an issue that any one organization, one foundation, one corporation is going to be able to solve. The idea is, how do we come together as a coalition? How do you come together, bring many voices from different sectors, and really begin to have those conversations to deal with these issues?
This is a question I love, because we love trainings in this sector. We love to be trained on things. Someone Meg is asking, do you find that training experiences help predominantly white funding organizations understand implicit bias and begin this conversation?
Yeah, that's another tough one. I think for some, but let's be honest, as a profession, I had to go through continuing education, so many hours every year. You go, you learn, you hear, some of it you retain, some of it you don't. Like anything, the more you put something into practice, the better you're going to get at it. So trainings are good, but unless you are practicing this idea of having conversations with people that don't look like you, accepting advice from people that don't look like you, and maybe even taking instructions from people that don't look like you, until you begin to develop those relationships and have real honest questions about what the differences are culturally, because we all know, physically and everything else, we're almost all the same. But that cultural difference, that cultural context is extremely important. And so trainings are great. I think there is a lot of information, a lot of history that, very intellectual white people don't know, which kind of surprises me at times. But if you haven't heard it, if no one's talked about it, then you don't know it. But take that training and then figure out how do you put it into practice. because unless you practice it, it'll be stored somewhere with all the other trainings that you've had in the past.
I mean, it is, it reminds me of something our CEO wrote today, which is that this is messy work. Don't expect to get it right all the time. And you can't, because it's messy, it doesn't mean you stay away from it. It's like, let's just all get messy on this together, because it's the only way we're going to get out of it.
Right.
Someone asked, I think sort of related to this point, when boards are not diverse and don't represent the communities, how do organizations go about changing that? And I mean, I personally think, you just have to do it, right? You just have to recruit people and start changing the makeup of the board. But do you have any particular advice on that?
Yeah, so, I agree with that. The end result is you have to diversify and you have to change, especially if you're saying that your organization is working to help a community that doesn't look like, the makeup of your organization, then you have to diversify. At the same time, I think there's some steps that you can do, in between. So if it's a foundation board, create a community advisory board, right? That has advisory power over so many dollars in your foundation, especially if they're going to certain communities. That's a way, I don't want to use this, I hate to use this type of terminology, but it's a great way to test drive that relationship. And then out of that group, maybe you find a couple people, that, you may invite as board members. I think the other dangerous thing is that we typically, especially on the foundation side, because it is a power institution, a power industry, we invite, all of those successful people that, we have relationship with, who we say, well, they've got to be extremely intelligent because they've been successful in business. But that doesn't mean that you know how best to reach, somebody in the community that you're trying to serve. So let's be bold and invite some people, right out the community, help them learn, help you learn at the same time. These are drastic measures. I don't know if most foundation boards are ready to go there, but I think at the end of the day, you've got to think through your particular foundation, set a goal, and then, think about how can this foundation reach that goal and what are those steps we need to take to get there.
Mm-hmm. And this is a question that's related. Someone's asking, well, is it really better to work with community ambassadors, so folks who sort of are intermediaries to a community, or directly with community, and have you had better success with one approach or the other?
Yeah, so I think ultimately the closer you can get to the community, the better. But then it goes back to what we're talking about, trust. So if I'm a white program officer of a foundation, I walk into a Black community and say, hey, I'm here to roll up my sleeves and help. There's a level of trust, right, that automatically doesn't exist. And so the fact that you're coming there and you're probably one of 50 that has come there before, maybe from various foundations, maybe from various sectors, and you're saying the same exact thing that we've heard before, but the community has never changed, right? So you have to understand that there is a level of trust that needs to be built up, even if you have the best intentions, right? You still have to get past that trust level. And that's why I started out saying, even though Poise Foundation is a Black foundation working directly with the Black community, we still will go find ambassadors in that community that already have that trust, that can then kind of sponsor us in, and then we can build our level of trust. But thinking always that you can just go from where you sit to the community could be damaging, right? And where we are today, you don't get a lot of do-overs. With communities that are, being impacted negatively. They're looking for, solutions, they're looking for help. They're not looking for another voice to come in for photo ops, and things like that. So you have to figure out, how do we create that line of trust?
And for a lot of our folks here, they may be from the nonprofit sector, and they may be sort of navigating the relationship with their funder and the relationship with their community. And sort of what are your thoughts, and maybe even just advice for others who are listening about what they should do to help strengthen the trust in sort of that entire path, right? Like in any level that you sit in, whether you are the Sure. whether you're the nonprofit, whether you're in community, what sorts of things can you do today to help improve that trust?
Right. So I think, I'm not sure if it gets down to I guess ultimately it would get to the trust level. My recommendation to nonprofits always is to, you're a service provider. You're the intermediary. And so often, like I said before, the conversation happens between the foundations and the nonprofits. Did you deliver the results that you said? Did you, do this? Did you accomplish what we wanted you to do? But then we often, again, leave that community out. So what I recommend to nonprofits that are really concerned about serving the community and using their organization as the nonprofit, not just the entity that needs to be sustained for purposes of sustaining the entity, bring people in, bring your customers with you, right? Show that your customers are saying that you're doing a good job, not that you're just going to the foundation saying, hey, we're doing all this great work. Bring the customer, that final customer that you're serving, bring them into the conversation to back you up. I'm always going to look at a nonprofit that has, all these community people to say, hey, this is a nonprofit that we want because they're delivering service, they're doing what we need them to do, versus one that just comes in and says, I'm the best thing out there, I've got all these results, but there's nobody behind them backing that up. So, and I think also nonprofits can be that great bridge between foundations and the community. You can be that ambassador. It doesn't always have to be just a individual. The nonprofit themselves can be that great ambassador between the foundation and the community.
Mm-hmm. So simple, but it's brilliant. I mean, like bring in your own live Yelp review, folks.
Exactly. That's
tell foundations what you've done for them. That's
right.
So thank you. That we're at our time. So thank you so much. Any last sort of parting words you want to give to our folks?
No, just thank you for allowing me to participate. Again, I think this trust issue is critical. We've got to get to a place in this country, and I think you mentioned it earlier, where we are willing to have conversations and not go into these conversations with a fear of offending somebody. Have honest conversations. I mean, your experience and your biases and your opinions are just that, they're yours. Doesn't mean they're always bad. I may come at it from a different perspective. That doesn't mean that we have to, just argue and leave arguing. Sometimes we just need to understand where we're coming from. And so often I think whether it's foundations and nonprofits or nonprofits in the community, definitely foundations in the community, we don't allow that to happen in the most genuine way to really build that trust. And trust is really about relationship. So at the end of the day, we've got to figure out how do we strengthen relationships, all through this sector, from the foundations all the way down to the community.
Well, thank you, Mark, for being here with us and for all your insights. It's a great conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure.